I want to start with the same question I've started with Senator Murray, and I don't have a good answer, which is nobody seems to want to start negotiating. Paul Ryan made it clear that they're not ready yet to start the conference process. They want to have sort of a side negotiation first. They don't think they're in a good place. The Senate Democrats, you were probably on the Senate floor last night and saw this exchange between Harry Reid and Ted Cruz, which got a little ugly there at the end about trying to start the negotiating clock. Why won't the clock start?
Well, I think there are two negotiations. One is the formal negotiation in a budget resolution, and given the budget that was passed in the Senate, I think the difference between the House and the Senate is so great that that's not likely to be successful.
You think that's not a useful exercise at this
Well,
point?
I think it's a useful exercise
so
because I think we need reconciliation at the end of the process, but not having the President's involvement and having a more middle ground approach that the administration can bring to the table if they choose to would make it very difficult to make any progress on these two very different approaches to the budget. The real negotiation has to take place, in my view, between the President and those of us in Congress who want to get something done. And that is beginning.
I was just going to say, is that, all right, you've been, these dinners, President golfing with a couple of people that we assume would be part of this group of 16 or 20 of Republicans that seem to be...
Saxby-Chambliss got a hole-in-one yesterday, which means that there will be no tax increases, which I think is great, great news.
So they bet on that. That was what it was.
It's great for the economy.
We have these 16 to 20 Republicans. This is how this process is going to go. Patty Murray and Paul Ryan are basically, they've got their budgets. They've done what they've had to do. But this process is between a group of you and the President?
No, I mean, I think everybody's going to be involved. I mean, in this town, nothing happens behind closed doors, which is okay. This needs to be something that is transparent. At the end of the day, this is going to affect the lives of millions of Americans in fundamental ways. And so, it's going to be a process. Everybody will be involved. Patty will be involved. Of course, Paul will be involved. But it requires presidential leadership. And, I've talked about this before. But if you look back, whether it's tax reform, 86, or whether it's Social Security reform, 83, really the last two examples where we did something significant to try to improve the economy and deal with our, at that point, what seemed to be a huge debt and deficit problem, which, by the way, seems small relative to what we have now. It has always involved presidential leadership. It must. First, the President's got to ultimately be supportive in order to have it become effective and enacted. But second, the resources of the Office of Management and Budget that I used to head and the Treasury Department and so on are critical to this. So, the President's got to step up and show leadership.
Well, did he not with this budget? Do you believe he did?
He started in a small way, and I think that's important. And as you know, I've talked a lot about that publicly and privately in our hearings we've had on the President's budget, talking about the fact that putting change CPI on the table at all, I think, is a step in the right direction. Saying in the budget, for the first time, by the way, that the savings that come from reducing some of the preferences in the corporate tax code ought to go back into lowering the rate rather than being used for deficit reduction generally, I think was a positive step. That's in the budget for the first time. So I think you take those small steps in the right direction and you build on them. And look, the President's taken some heat from his side of the aisle on change CPI.
And some members of the Republican Party seem to want more interested in the politics of this. I mean, you had Chairman of the House Republican Campaign Committee, Greg Walden, say just that.
Yeah, look, it's a more accurate measure of inflation. It's the right thing to do, in my view, from a policy point of view. In terms of the politics, there are Republicans who believe that we should wait until
for what?
Until we can have another election. Perhaps,
the last one wasn't good enough?
Perhaps getting a majority in 2014 in the Senate, perhaps getting a new president in 2016. I don't think the country can wait. I mean, I honestly believe that we're in trouble as a country, both in terms of the fiscal problem, but also in terms of our economy. And if we wait until 2017, which is in essence what that's saying, that attitude, I think we're taking a huge risk. And so I think we have to engage. And I'm not suggesting that...
How many people share your view in the Senate, in the conference, Republican conference?
Republican conference? I think the majority, honestly.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there are some who, are unlikely to be there almost no matter what. But there are others who are going to take a hard look at this who might surprise you. I mean, I think there are a lot of members who understand that this is a pivotal point in our nation's history. It's not just about getting through the debt limit. It's about dealing with what is otherwise going to be a huge impact on the people we represent because our standard of living will go down, because we are risking a financial crisis that would make the one in 08 and 09 look relatively small. You look right now what's happening. The stock market's looking pretty good. Wages are going down. I mean, so it's an economic issue, too. There's a real squeeze out there. Healthcare costs up, wages down. People who our serious legislators on both sides of the aisle recognize that this is a pivotal point and we have to act. And by the way, if you think about it, in the past, dealing with issues like tax reform or entitlements, I mentioned 83 and 86, it tends to come with divided government. George Bush tried this, as you recall, with Social Security when there was a Republican Congress. It didn't get very far.
No.
In part because of the politics. They're tough. No question about it. It's that third rail of the New York subway system. You grab and you're electrocuted.
Right.
And if you grab it together, you sort of spread the shock a little bit. And that's the opportunity that I see really in the next several months here, and we've got to take advantage of it.
I've had some Senate Democrats, and I don't, not the Senate Democrat that was up here, but some Senate Democrats whisper to me, unnamed, say, don't Republicans realize they'll never have an easier negotiating partner on the other side of the aisle than President Obama? And in fact, they say this out of, some of that is out of fear. They think President Obama is going to be more of a compromiser than they would be in the Senate Democrats.
Yeah.
How many Republicans sort of either believe that that is true?
Well, Chuck, you and I may disagree on this, but the President had an opportunity with his own fiscal commission to step up. He chose not to. He rejected their recommendation.
Do you think if he endorsed Bull Simpson unequivocally at that time, owned it, and the only place to find it right now is on whitehouse.gov. I always like pointing that out to folks. But if he had endorsed that, owned it, do you really believe there would have been bipartisan support for it?
Life would have been very different. You had, as you know, senators, including all the Republicans who showed up to work on that commission, Tom Coburn being one, a very conservative senator, supporting it. I mean, it would have been very different.
A bunch of Republicans jumped off, didn't end up. That commission could have had teeth on it. That commission, the president had to appoint because a bunch of senators backed out,
including some Democrats. But look, my point is this: if you look at this president's record in terms of his inability to show leadership on these issues, there's no wonder there's some skepticism. When Paul Ryan came out with his budget, instead of saying there's some stuff we can do here, this is the budget from last year, there was a frontal attack, with Paul sitting in the front row. And so I understand the skepticism. It's a healthy skepticism. It's based on some of the previous actions of the administration or inaction. But I think those Democrats are making a point that we ought to listen to. And look,
meaning you do buy into the idea that you probably you might get a better deal from President Obama than you would from Harry Reid.
Yeah, I mean, it's trust but verify, but not to even engage, I think, is a huge mistake. Let's see whether he's serious or not. If he's sincere, I do believe we can do something significant. It may not be called the grand bargain, but folks, unless we get started, both on the economic growth side of this, which is, in my view, tax reform, and then also on dealing with this long-term problem, which is not going to be solved unless we get at the mandatory spending, which is now about 65% of the budget, growing at a faster rate than the rest of the budget. CBO just told us that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, incredibly vital programs, and we've got to save them, but that they will grow at 95% over the next 10 years. They'll grow by almost double. They've also told us, by the way, that if we don't do something on the spending side, we'll go from about 22% of GDP today to about 39% in 3 decades. Historic average, as you know, is 20% over the last 50 years. You can't catch that with enough taxes. It's simply not possible. So when folks talk about balance, you ought to ask them, are they talking about revenues, which are now projected to be at 19%, spending at 39%? This is in a few decades. This is not, like next century. Are they talking about 29%? Is that the balance? If so, higher taxes by far, person we've ever had. More than doubling of all of your taxes. We couldn't get there, in my view, with 100% taxes on the wealthy, so we have to come up with a new tax form based on the historical data on what it was like when we had a 70% tax rate and so on. So when people say, like me, we've got to deal with the spending, this is, as Bill Clinton said famously at the Democrat convention in another context, it's math. I mean, this is not ideology.
But do you walk in, but speaking of ideology, I feel like I heard some from Senator Murray when it came to the issue of Medicare age, and I feel like I heard some of it from Paul Ryan when it came to the issue of taxes and revenue. Do you walk into this saying, I'm not going to be a part of any deal that includes any more tax increases?
No, I walk into it saying we've got to solve the issue, which is spending. And if there's a sincere effort on spending, and if we come up with some changes that are really structural changes to begin to bend the curve, and if we do tax reform, not just...
And it ends up raising revenue, and it ends up raising a little revenue, you can sign on to something like that.
Well, look, I mean, we'll see. I do think that
See, we're making progress, right? We had one, right?
I do think that one of the factors we have to look at is behavioral changes, and therefore what people call macroeconomic or dynamic scoring. And as you know, in the budget debate in the Senate, I offered an amendment that was actually passed by the United States Senate that said, yes, we should have the benefit of looking at the dynamic score. Why did I want that so badly? Because both how you design tax reform and how you look at this issue in terms of revenue ought to include what the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, not some of these outside groups, but what our internal analysis says in terms of what the macroeconomic impact is going to be. And it will show with regard to the business tax reform, which, as you know, I'm very focused on, because if we don't do this, we're going to continue to lose jobs and businesses overseas. And on the individual side, there will be revenue increase through growth. Now, the President's going to insist on some status scored revenue, he says, in order to do anything on entitlements. Those of us who are interested in getting to yes are going to have to look at that and look at it in the context of what other aspects of tax reform are going to help the economy. So this will be the discussion. And by the way, it is a discussion that has been taking place really for 5 or 6 years. You look at these other commissions.
I was just going to say, are we really that? I mean, I hate to say, it feels like we have. There's all these things on the shelf. You can just pick and choose. It's even a la carte, right? Oh, I like this from Alice Riven. I like this one from Alan Simpson. Is it that easy, you think?
It's not quite that easy, because there's a little thing in Congress called scoring. So, people say, gosh, just pick up this proposal. Well, when you go through the process, for instance, on tax reform, you've got to go through the Joint Committee on Taxation, and you've got to live by their score in order to legislate. So legislating is a little more difficult than coming up with a recommendation at commission. But having said that, there are a lot of good ideas out there. We're not lacking ideas. We're lacking political will. And I do believe that if we don't solve this problem, again, we put the country in great jeopardy.
All right, let me get